The next space that we'll talk about, well, pure and simply, what do you call the space that contains the parotid gland? Well, it's the parotid space. So just to emphasize where we've gone so far, this was the masticator space here. This was the visceral space here. This was the retropharyngeal space, and this was the prevertebral space. Now we're going to look at this triangular area right here, and this is the parotid gland or the parotid space. Now, I know you're all familiar with the parotid space. The thing that I want to emphasize is the nerve that's associated with the parotid space. So the nerve that's associated with the parotid space is the facial nerve. So you have the main trunk of the facial nerve exiting the stylomastoid foramen. It then has its 5 branches right here, and the 5 branches form a plane of the parotid gland, which separates the parotid gland into a superficial and a deep lobe. So when you are evaluating patients that have parotid space masses, yes, it's good to give a differential diagnosis, but what's as important is to determine whether the abnormality is in the superficial or the deep lobe. So this is both examples of parotid space masses. These lesions have high signal on T2, and the most common benign tumor to involve the parotid gland is going to be pleomorphic adenoma. Now, both of these are palpable lesions, but the surgeons don't know the deep extent. If you say that this lesion is involving the superficial lobe, well, yes, then the patients can just undergo a superficial parotidectomy. Now, how do we know that it's in the superficial lobe? Because when we look back, we can see a little vein right here. What do you call a vein behind the mandible? Well, that's a retromandibular vein, and the facial nerve is going to be just lateral to that vein. So as a result, when we say it's in the superficial lobe, the surgeons can do a superficial parotidectomy, and it's a relatively benign procedure. But in this case, what we have here is a mass involving the deep lobe of the parotid, and it is extending deeply to involve the parapharyngeal space. So in this case, the surgeons would have to do a total parotidectomy. When we talk about facial nerve malignancies, remember that, parotid malignancies, remember the facial nerve. These tumors can jump on the facial nerve and grow superiorly along the descending portion of that facial nerve. So this is an example of adenoid cystic carcinoma. In general, the surgeons already know that the patients have a malignancy. Why? Because the facial nerve is not working. So if the facial nerve is not working, then the next decisions that the surgeons have to make is, can I do a parotidectomy by itself? Or on the other hand, if the tumor is actually involved in the descending portion of the facial nerve, do I need to go in and actually drill out the facial nerve? And if it's actually too extensive, they may end up treating the patients with chemotherapy and radiation therapy. So this is all really important information. So this is an example of the adenoid cystic carcinoma. And when we look a little bit higher, notice the abnormal enhancement of the descending facial nerve on the right compared to that on the left. So this is all cephalad extension or retrograde perineural extension along the 7th nerve. Again, the surgeons usually know the facial nerve is out, but they don't know the extent. And this is where we really make a difference in how these patients are treated. Well, in the parotid space, if you see bilateral lesions like this, we do have a differential diagnosis. If the patient does not have a history of a lymphoproliferative disorder, such as lymphoma, if they don't have a history of a primary tumor like melanoma, because these could be metastases, if the patients are smokers, and they are sort of middle-aged folks, this is the example of Warthin's tumors. So Warthin's tumors typically arise from the interparotid lymph nodes. That's why they're multiple and bilateral. And the classical appearance is located in the tail of the parotid gland, especially in patients that smoke. So this is just an example of bilateral parotid lesions. Sometimes we call these earring lesions because they're located right at the tail of the parotid gland. And this is an example of multiple cysts involving the parotid glands. This is a patient that's HIV positive, and this is the classical example of lymphoepithelial cysts. So in lymphoepithelial cysts, you can have these large cystic lesions. And if you see something like this, always remember to get testing for HIV.